Hi, ladies. Looking ahead at the calendar, I just realized that we only have about a month left of this semester. So things are going very quickly, which is good. This week, you have two chapters to read, and they talk about lots of different letters. So I'll keep my comments fairly minimal about each of the letters. So the first chapter is talking about Philippians and Philemon. And these two are grouped together because they're both what we call captivity letters. This means that they're letters that Paul wrote while he was in prison. And some people used to believe that he was in Rome while he wrote these, but some more modern theologians think he might have been in Ephesus because Ephesus was a lot closer to Philippi, and he clearly had traveled there many times. Philippi was a town that, again, Paul had traveled many times, and he was clearly pretty close to the Philippians. And that's clear in the letter that he writes to them. So this letter kind of has the tone of someone who is dying and they're writing kind of their last words to the people that they really love dearly. So he's very close to them. And this is usually seen as his warmest letter. And in it, you'll see that there is a hymn that is one of the most beautiful in the Bible. And it's kind of the emptying hymn where it talks about how Jesus emptied himself to take the form of a human, and at his name every knee shall bend, and it's really beautiful. And the whole letter to the Philippians is probably my favorite letter of all of them, again, because it is his warmest letter. The next one of the captivity letters that chapter 16 talks about is Philemon. And just a little background on this, the letter itself is quite short. It's not even more than one chapter. It's just a certain number of verses. And in Philemon, what you have is a slave whose name is Onesimus, who has escaped from Philemon's house and went to Paul, or became acquainted with Paul in some way, shape, or form, and is converted by Paul. So Paul sends this letter with Onesimus back to Philemon, knowing that the letter will be read aloud in front of a community of people. And so that really puts Philemon on the spot. Now, technically, he could have Onesimus killed, but the message that Paul gives in this letter is because Onesimus has been baptized, he's now your equal, and you need to see him as your brother instead of your slave. And one thing that people have criticized historically is that Paul doesn't actually criticize slavery here, but rather points out that once a person is baptized, that elevates their status. So those are the two remaining genuine Pauline letters that I hadn't talked about yet. And again, two captivity letters. Colossians and Ephesians are two letters that were also captivity letters, but they would be categorized under the disputed and the pseudonymous letters. Disputed meaning that theologians don't 100% agree whether Paul wrote them or not. And pseudonymous meaning that we most likely think they were written by someone anonymous who claimed to be Paul. So chapter 17 is more about these disputed letters that are pseudonymous. And this is referring to like having a pseudonym or a fake name. So a little bit about those letters. Colossians and Ephesians are in there. So is 2 Thessalonians. So with 2 Thessalonians, this letter, most theologians don't think that Paul actually wrote, and that's mostly because he kind of says the opposite of what he says in 1 Thessalonians about the second coming of Jesus. In 1 Thessalonians, it seems like he believes this is going to happen any day, and in 2 Thessalonians, he warns them that they need to wait and be patient and not just stop living, that they need to continue living. So then we have Colossians and Ephesians. Again, I would say the biggest reason that people don't think Paul wrote Colossians is because it has a really kind of elaborate Christology that really wouldn't have been developed at the time Paul was writing these letters. And then Ephesians also is a little bit different than the typical kind of style of writing that Paul would use. This is written much more like a poetic sermon, and Paul didn't usually write like that. Colossians and Ephesians are very similar in their content. Ephesians, I think, is kind of well known because it has a passage in there that I think people have kind of misinterpreted, if you will. And in it, it says, wives, be submissive to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And so many people have taken this passage pretty literally and believe that men should be kind of the head of the household. But the reality is, when this was written, if it was written and read in front of a group of people, the radical thing that it said at that time would have been that husbands should love their wives. At that time, wives were already submissive, so that was kind of like unnecessary to say. But to say that husbands should love their wives the way that Christ loved the church, which means to be willing to die for your wife, that was very radical. And so, again, it's kind of well known for that verse. And then finally, chapter 17 goes into detail about what are known as the pastoral letters. And these claim that Paul wrote them, but theologians do not believe Paul wrote them, and that they are written by a pseudonymous author who claims to be Paul. And they're called pastoral letters because they're giving advice to pastors, namely Timothy and Titus. And so when you read the chapter, you'll read a little bit more about these people, but they would have traveled with Paul, helped him set up some of the churches, and then he left them in charge of their churches, and now they're getting kind of information or guidance on how to lead those churches. So enjoy the reading. You have a discussion again this week, and then next week is the last quiz. Have a great week, everyone.